I'm Jason Marczak. I'm the Director of Policy here and also Senior Editor of America's Quarterly Magazine, and also lead our Hispanic Integration and Immigration Initiative. And I'd like to begin by welcoming everybody here. There's a lot of new faces and familiar faces, including those who are joining us by webcast from all across the country, and I think even internationally. I'd like to also note this is a joint event with the New York Immigration Coalition. Chung-Wha, its Executive Director, is on tonight's panel, and Chung-Wha, we look forward to continuing to work together. We're already batting around some ideas before this panel, continuing to work together as we move forward. Qualitas of Life Foundation, which teaches financial literacy to Hispanics in New York, also collaborated in the outreach for tonight's program. Tonight we have a very esteemed panel that will be looking at a critical and I think often overlooked issue, and that is how unauthorized immigration status affects the developmental outcomes of children and adolescents and the resulting policy implications. And what does this mean for their development, their future, and especially the future role of these children in the U.S. economy? You have the bios in front of you of all of our panelists, but I will just briefly introduce them. Next to me is Carola Suárez-Orozco, and Carola is the professor of applied psychology at New York University Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development. She also co-directs immigration studies at NYU with her husband, Marcelo Suárez-Orozco, who's also here with us tonight, and is also co-author, and I believe the lead author, is that correct, on the excellent article that will be forming the basis of our discussion tonight, which is Growing Up in the Shadows, the Developmental Implications of Unauthorized Status. She co-authored that with Marcelo, with fellow panelist Hirokazu Yoshikawa, and Robert Teranashi. The abstract of that is in your packets. Next to Carola is Chung-Wha. Chung-Wha is the Executive Director of the New York Immigration Coalition, which for those of you who don't know NYIC, is an advocacy group of about 200 organizations across New York. And NYIC just recently held its annual Immigrants Day of Action up in Albany. And how many people did you bring up for that, Chung-Wha?
1,300.
1,300. That's fantastic. Absolutely fantastic.
Including many in the audience.
Including many in the audience.
Yes. Thank you.
Looking for passage of hopefully the New York State DREAM Act in this particular session. We'll get into that later. And finally, Hiro Yoshikawa. Hiro is the Walter H. Gale Professor of Education and the Academic Dean at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Along with his various achievements and co-authorship of the article with Carola and the others, he also recently published a groundbreaking book titled Immigrants, Raising Citizens, Undocumented Parents and Their Young Children. It looks at the effects of parents' unauthorized status on their children's development in New York City. And I understand from here this is going to be the first of additional studies that will be coming out and you'll be looking at in the future.
Kids keep getting older.
Kids keep getting older.
That's the point of the article, actually.
They keep changing. No. So, Carola, I'd like to start the discussion with you. Immigration discussion in the U.S., especially those that focus on the undocumented, tend to focus on the adult population, or when it comes to children and adolescents, on the DREAM Act, which is obviously very important. But not enough attention is focused on the implications of children, including U.S. citizens, who grew up in households where at least one member of the family, especially a parental member, is not authorized. Can you give us quantitatively an idea nationwide what the scope is of kids who are growing up with a family member that lacks documentation?
Certainly. The U.S. Has approximately 5% of the world population, and we have the dubious honor of having 20% of the unauthorized or undocumented population. So proportionally, we're way out of line. There are about 11 million unauthorized immigrants in the U.S. across ages. About 1.1 million are unauthorized with this under the age of 18. Another roughly million have aged into early adulthood, having spent most of their life much of their lives in the U.S. And then there are another 4.5 million children who are citizen children born in the United States, but who have unauthorized, one or more unauthorized parents, and possibly unauthorized, and often unauthorized siblings as well.
And those, and just to clarify, those are 4.5. Those are U.S. citizen children.
That's right. 4.5 million are born in the U.S., thus citizen children. And so, I'll just want to say that these are all kids who are American in spirit, in their education, and sort of their experience of being in the United States, and yet they are not. They are completely marginalized.
Yeah. And here, when we're talking about unauthorized status, is often mistakenly thought of as a black and white issue, but it's much more complicated. There are multiple layers, different levels of documentation. How prevalent are these various documentation patterns in families? If you could talk a little bit about some of these different documentation patterns that Carola is referring to in regard to these 5.5 million children.
Yeah. So, for example, I think right now there are endless queues and growing queues of folks who are waiting for some kind of papers. And so there are 3.5 million immediate family members of U.S. citizens who are awaiting visas overseas. And many of these folks are folks who've actually been in the U.S. and gone back to a country of origin to then apply for citizenship or a visa, and many of them are waiting 5, 10, 15 or more years. So, and the current wait for business-sponsored green cards is between 6 and 20 years. So these are millions of additional people, because the 5.5 million are people in the U.S., right? So we can also consider the millions who are outside the U.S. who, may have grown up in the U.S. And are in this. I think in our article, Carola and Marcelo called this a kind of a liminal state, just being neither here nor there, without nation or citizenship for it can be decades. And of course, as far as child development goes, we have to be concerned about the different developmental periods. And so if 10 or 15 years means one thing for someone who's going from 30 to 45, it means a whole other thing for a child who's going from ages 2 to 17.
And in many of these families, you see it's either maybe both parents might be unauthorized, maybe it's a sibling, maybe it's one parent. So there's multiple layers, and each has different effects on the children in the family.
That's right. And just to add to the already disturbing numbers that Carola mentioned, the 5.5 million children with at least one unauthorized parent, that constitutes 1/3 of all children of immigrants in the United States. So that's really an enormous proportion of children of immigrants. And if we're thinking about immigration as it has always been, the economic engine of America, to have 1/3 of the next generation under this kind of status and experiencing the risks, I mean, we're going to argue this is not something that's positive for children's development. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to say that this is an adversity that ultimately strengthens kids' development. There is no evidence of that. This is overall, whether you yourself as a child growing up are unauthorized, or you have at least one member of the family who's unauthorized, I think this article brings together the current evidence showing that this is harmful to multiple aspects of children's development.
And Chung-Wha, here in New York, where do you see these mixed status households? Is this across the city, or are there certain areas of the city, and how do those different areas deal with that reality?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, in New York State, statewide, there's about 700,000 undocumented immigrants, and many of them are spread out in mixed status families. And in the city, that's about 500,000. I also want to bring some statistics that puts New York State in a kind of a national perspective. Kids who are undocumented, often it's overlapped with kids who also don't speak English, and they're called English language learners. So first of all, in the school system, half of the entire public school student population come from immigrant families. Most of them, a lot of them from mixed status families, that's half. And then out of that, about 15% of the whole school population are ELLs who don't speak English, English language learners. Now, 15% may sound low, but it's equivalent to the entire population of Salem, Oregon, the entire city. So we're talking about, New York City, has the biggest public school system in the country. So the scale of this problem and the kind of systemic changes that we need to try to promote, and also we have the best diversity, out of all the, cities across the country. We don't have a dominant group, and so any sort of policy changes or initiatives or programs that we're going to launch need to take into account the specific dynamics within those communities. For instance, just in the case of the Mexican community, it's very different. The profiles of immigrants are very different from, some of the, South Asian communities. And so we need to be respectful of those differences and build on the community infrastructures and the resources that we have.
And I want to get into some of the developmental outcomes that you talked about in your report, but before going into that, I just want to drill down these numbers a little bit more. When we're talking about the number of children that are growing up in these mixed-status households, Carola, how does that compare to the overall number of children in schools across the U.S. Today?
Well, about roughly 23 to 24% of the children in public schools today are children of immigrants. Is that right?
So if you take 1/3 of that, the number is roughly 1 in every 15 or 16 kids in every public elementary school classroom in the United States has at least one member who's unauthorized.
So that's across the nation.
Yeah, so that would be taking the average across the nation. Obviously, in a place like New York, I think, as Chung-Wha points out, because of the diversity and the historically and continuing high rates of immigration to New York City, we would expect that to be quite a bit higher in New York City public schools.
But it's clear. This is a nationwide issue that everybody must be concerned about. 1 in every 15 or 16 children. In the article, you talk about the developmental risks for kids in mixed status families, and the result of factors at many levels. And I encourage everybody to read the article. But it's a result of factors from harsh public policies and discriminatory attitudes toward immigrants, to a fear of interacting with local authorities, and also being caught in the situation of being in under-resourced schools, and also kind of individual aspects in the family level too that affect developmental outcomes. I'll also say too that on a policy level, which affects some of many of these children, these worrying trends continue in the U.S. Across the country, especially in the Southeast, with a continued push for restrictive policies. Many of you might have seen that actually just last night there was a bill in the Georgia Congress that was going to deny undocumented immigrants from even attending college. Not even financial aid, but even attending college. It was taken out in a House bill just last night. But it contributes to this visceral climate that we're seeing across the country that affects these children. Here, you've done some groundbreaking research on the specific context of early childhood and what some of these effects are, how this mixed status situation affects children. How do you see these societal risks specifically impacting the very young, especially when it comes to their health and also to their cognitive development, two different issues that you talk about? Sure.
So this comes from the book Immigrants Raising Citizens, and it was following about 400 families in New York. We recruited the moms pretty much the day or the day after they gave birth in public hospitals in New York. And we had Chinese, Mexican, and Dominican low-income first-generation moms and their newborns. And we've been following them for 6 years. But the book is about the first 3 years of their lives. And so we collected all kinds of data. I'm a developmental psychologist, so we did direct child assessments, but we also did in-depth ethnographic work with these families. So we really kind of got to know the texture of their lives. And this theme of unauthorized status, it turned out, played a very powerful role in their everyday experiences, but also their kids' development. So on health, actually, out of our data set, we just have a new study that came out last month in the journal Health Psychology by Mei Ling Halim. And she showed that for our low-income immigrant families, including the undocumented, when they experience discrimination based on ethnic on their ethnicity or their language status, that actually increased the frequency of sick child visits. So there was a relationship between discrimination and illness in their children. And this is controlling for well-child visits, so controlling for regular checkups. These kids were getting sick more often. And a colleague of mine, it was interesting you mentioned the Southeast. My study was, I guess, the first study to look at unauthorized status as it affects the development of children in the first years of life. Krista Pereira, who's a health economist at the University of North Carolina, just emailed me today a summary of a set of studies she's done on looking at parent unauthorized status. And so she also finds that the combination of parental unauthorized status and the experiences of discrimination result in higher depression, higher anxiety in both the parents and their youth. So she studies older kids, generally between the ages of 12 and 18. But so I think there's evidence that this is harmful for both health outcomes and mental health outcomes.
Yeah.
And then I can get into kind of the mechanisms later, but in fact, unauthorized status of parents in our study was harming children's development in aspects like their cognitive skills, their vocabulary, as early as at 24 months, and really consistently further on, also at 36 months and into the preschool years.
I'd like to get back to that. Chung-Wha, your NYIC in the community every day working on these type of issues. How have you seen some of the effects of, especially on health or on cognitive development being played out with kids?
Right. I mean, I want to emphasize that these are barriers that we can remove. I mean, for instance, non-citizens are 3 times as likely to be uninsured. So even as our Supreme Court is debating, health insurance, why should non-citizens be 3 times as likely to be uninsured? So let's remove barriers to some of the basic kind of, factors that are either limiting and holding back the achievements. Because, I think without interventions, I think the danger signals are clear. But when we actually look at examples of communities, and we have some of the community members here, where parents and the school system and the community groups all work together, we can actually turn around the model so that we're actually facilitating a family empowerment. So I just want to give a shout out to some of the schools and parents who are doing this work every day. La Union and Leticia and her parents, and Gregorio Luperon, the generals from Luperon Curtis High School is here. PS24, Cristina Fuentes and her staff. So what we're trying to do is, come out with program models that remove barriers. So, because the unauthorized status basically puts up barriers to access to education and access to financial institutions and financial resources, for example. So we decided to tackle those 2 issues by starting with, in some Latin American communities, starting with the consular IDs. Because if you don't have an ID, you can't open a bank account. Huge amounts of immigrants, 20% of Hispanics population are unbanked. We want to change that, but you need an ID to go and open a bank account and start having a college savings account, and and so on, and tax ID number so that you can apply for financial aid. If your child is a citizen, you also need an ID if you're a parent and you need to go to a school. The school, security guard wants an ID for you to enter school, and then ultimately, we need to remove barriers like providing equal access to financial aid. So New York State DREAM Act is one immediate opportunity that we have to remove that. So I think, thank you for having us here as part of the discussion, because for every barrier that we're going to identify, I believe that there is a solution, and we need to make sure that those solutions are replicated and are invested in, and where we can really show the impact.
Yeah. And that is the key of this discussion, is getting into some of those solutions. I want to talk first quickly about another barrier, though. Carola, you've studied focused on children and adolescents, insofar as how educational trajectories are affected by being in mixed status households. Can you elaborate a little bit on what the future effective for these kids are, especially as these kids try to enter into the labor force?
Well, there are all sorts of educational issues that they're encountering. They're often attending less than optimal schools, exceptions in the audience, of course. But they're often attending less resource schools, which are then providing them with, not the best education. They often are living in situations which cause their parents to move frequently. So, you move, you change schools, there's disruptions in schooling. So the kids are starting behind. Their parents are less able to get involved in the schools because they're often afraid, unless they're in a school that they know they can trust. They're less likely to take their kids to school, to get involved in any of the many ways that we know are good for children's education. And so that puts them, and then of course many of these kids live in daily fear that their parents will be taken away. So, which is a chronic stress that is hard to quantify, but it's unimaginable that it doesn't have an effect on kids. And so these kids, when they get to high school and they're beginning to apply for college, many of them discover that they themselves are unauthorized. They may not have known until they apply for a driver's license or apply for financial aid, and then they realize that they are blocked. So they have to kind of come to consciousness. There are all sorts of developmental and identity issues around realizing that your whole world is shaken and that you may not belong in the way you thought. They have problems with financial aid forms because their parents may not have tax IDs. So even though their parents may have been paying into the system, they don't have, they don't have tax IDs, which means that they are not receiving the kinds of services they have. The kind of financial aid that they are entitled to. And so what you see in high school is a lot of kids giving up and withdrawing, so that's what we found in our study. While some kids get really mobilized and they're going to do it, luchando, sort of against all odds in spite of it all. Yeah. Others are, have been involved in school and then they just kind of give up and pull out. Yeah. And then the ones who do persist, I'll just briefly say, and then the ones who do persist onto college, you see some kids pursuing multiple degrees as they wait and wait and wait and wait for the DREAM Act to come through. So you'll have kids with multiple master's degrees, and then others, when they finally do hit the labor market, they're underemployed and often working in the same kinds of jobs that their parents are working in underground.
Yeah, just to add to that, since we don't have exact statistics for undocumented students, we have some more statistics for English language learners, but I think there's, striking similarities. Only about 40% of ELLs graduate from high school, compared to about 60% of the general population, so the gap is huge. But if you also look at college readiness, which is different from graduation rates, only 7% of ELLs are college ready. I was talking to Jay Hershenson, our wonderful CUNY vice chancellor. Mm-hmm. He was saying 80% of CUNY kids need remediation because they're just not college ready. 7%, single digit is just not. It's just not acceptable as a percentage of kids who are college ready. So we need to really have a comprehensive strategy to look at our education system. Before early education, and then look at K through 12, and then look at higher education, and come out with very targeted ways of improving those numbers.
Yeah, and Chung-Wha, what are some of the things maybe on the ground level that kind of going to the second part of our discussion, what parents, educators, community groups can do to help to overcome some of these barriers that we're talking about?
Well, I think the best models I've seen are a coming together. Nobody can do this by themselves. Parents can't do this by themselves. School principals can't do it by themselves. Community groups. So it's kind of coming together of powerful partnerships. And so we have a project called Family Resource Centers, where it's a partnership between the school and the community organization and parents, and in some cases, Latin American consul generals, the consulate, to provide the whole, the ID as the point of departure to accessing these other services. And so at these family resource centers, we have the school leadership working with the community to get parents into the schools and work on, access to financial services and to college readiness, parent education. But we're doing it in a way that builds long-term relationships, that provides a vehicle for sustained engagement of parents, not like come to this event, come to this workshop. Come and be part of the mutual learning and be part of the decision making, help us change our school culture. So even though it's similar barriers, if you go to schools that are here, the vibrant spirit in those schools are just amazing, and that is kind of one of the best solutions. And I just have to acknowledge Claire Sylvan, who's with the Internationals Network, running these schools who have graduation rates are just nationally recognized, working with the immigrant and recent immigrant kids. So we have so many models in New York, but I think the key is partnerships, and then getting the political leaders to invest in these replicable models. So we always need to work on that.
Yeah. And here, that's in your study as well. One of the points that you and Carola and the others make as well is that the parents in these families are very committed to their children, but that there's the barriers that they face as Chung-Wha was talking about, whether it's ID barriers insofar as being able to access resources and other types of barriers that are really that prevent parents from being able to engage as much. What do you see as some of the ways to move that discussion forward?
Well, I can tell two stories of I think why these family resource centers and similar community-based organizations and partnerships are so important. One is that in a few cases, our field workers who were in there spending hundreds of hours with these families were the first to tell the more recently arrived undocumented parents that there were such things as public libraries in New York City. So there were literally parents who had just no idea that in the United States public libraries existed and that these existed in their communities. Another is the some agreement.
Background music.
Yeah, good. We didn't have the funds for a live band, but now we do.
Yeah. Sorry, we didn't need the live band.
No, it's okay. The other really harmful mechanism where I think we can make a difference is the work conditions of these parents. So one of our undocumented fathers, for example, and this was quite typical, had been doing delivery for Delhi for 15 years, had not gotten a raise, was ashamed to tell his kids as they were getting older that he was quote unquote a delivery boy. Had hurt his knees through falls on the ice. And one of the community-based organizations I profile, Little Sisters, and the director, Gary Carter, and his staff are here today, and they do a fabulous job with the Mexican-American community in East Harlem. And one of the ways they get around these work barriers, and it's just an outrage, I think, that undocumented parents in no state can get a GED. In most states can't even sit in a GED class, don't qualify for any public job training dollars for the most part, no federal dollars, of course, so nothing related to workforce investment. But there's a innovative workers co-op program through the Family Life Center at Sunset Park, but also Little Sisters in East Harlem that are doing a lot of work training parents to actually run businesses. And that is something that one can do regardless of citizenship status. So I think some of these innovative workforce development models focused on entrepreneurship, on workers co-ops, are really powerful as well.
And Carola, you mentioned in the article you talk about, I think it's quote, which was a line that particularly struck me, that our current policies are, quote, writing off millions of productive potential citizens is economically self-destructive and civically reckless, which I think pretty much sums up the situation we're in right now. What do you think? What can be done? What do you think can be done in the present policy context for these kids?
Well, at the very least, the lowest hanging fruit is the DREAM Act, both in the New York more immediately within the New York Conference.
Yeah. Maybe he's joining us by webcast today.
Be happy to do it. I think I did call. I actually called his office yesterday, put in a call if it's helpful. But so at the very least, the New York DREAM Act locally, and then of course the National DREAM Act. That's the most obvious. But I think that really we have to look towards comprehensive reform, because the DREAM Act will help the 1.1 million kids who are below the ages of 18. Or who are on the kind of the younger end of the spectrum and who fall within all the regulations, but it doesn't help the 4.5 million whose parents are unauthorized. And I think that one of the points that we try to make in the article is that even if the child themselves is authorized, if their parents are unauthorized, they have many resources cut off to them, and they have much. They live under greater stress. There are all sorts of implications. So we have people living in the shadows, we have the psychological cost, and of course there's the economic cost, because we've invested in these kids up until high school, and then,
Yeah, there's also the effect insofar as many of these kids, the 1 million of the 5.5 that we're talking about, the 1 million that are actually undocumented, their brothers or sisters might be citizen children, and they might not know until they're 15 that they don't have documentation, but their brother has documentation. And that obviously has huge detrimental emotional effects.
Huge. I remember one young woman that I interviewed. She was the middle child, and her oldest sister was unauthorized. And she was the oldest sister was the one with the dreams to become a doctor. But the parents had made the decision that, and also because of economic reasons, that the oldest child would not go. Not be invested in terms of college, and they wanted to send the middle child, who was more of a free spirit and an artist, and so she was carrying the burden of the family and very much, hurting and rebelling against it.
There's all sorts of. Just to add, you were saying that some people didn't know that there were public libraries. We did some focus groups with our community partners to see what the knowledge around college and financial planning for college was. A lot of parents didn't know the difference between financial aid and a loan. A lot of people who, we had this one family whose father just put cash. They had to call the super to the house after he unfortunately passed away to get money out of the wall, because he was stuffing cash into the wall between the walls instead of opening a bank account. And in New York, we have great programs where the city work with the banks to provide low cost or no fee checking accounts. So there are ways of bringing people into the financial mainstream and into the educational pipeline, but there are these very distinct barriers that we have to move. And I feel like for the DREAM Act, the moral case has been made, the economic case has been made, even the political case has been made with the increasing demographic numbers of immigrants. So all we need now is the political will, to just kind of make it happen. And we will all feel so good as a state, because I think that the nation needs a powerful message coming from New York, and it's incumbent. We are so lucky that we have so many immigrants in New York who can, so that we're not always a super minority, and I think that comes with the responsibility to be a leader on immigrant issues. So it is just so great to have such diverse kinds of leaders in the audience and up here. So this kind of forum is so useful.
And so everybody knows the legislative session ends in June, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I want to open up to questions from the audience and also from everybody joining us by webcast. And after this next question, but Chung-Wha said a quick follow-up on your questions. People are thinking about theirs. What is the role of community groups insofar as creating trust? Because there are these multiple services that are available in New York and other states, maybe more so in New York, that maybe people don't know about or maybe don't trust that they can actually use those services.
Right. Immigrant individuals don't just come into a system. Immigrants need an intermediary to help them kind of interact with the system, because these systems are so huge and complicated. Even native-born Americans don't understand the education system or how to navigate the healthcare system so that you don't get billed twice. And so community organizations and the nonprofit infrastructure that we have in New York is just so important in making sure that these disparate immigrant community members have a vehicle, a conduit through which they can access the resources that are available. And these community-based organizations also serve as the political voice as well in smaller communities that don't have elected leaders. So I think it's really important to invest in the community-based infrastructure and not just the government infrastructure, because both to hold the government accountable but help perfect the things that are working, that's on the ground. We know what's working and we know what's not working. So, our 200 member organizations working throughout the state have played that role, but that just needs to be expanded and supported through initiatives like the Family Resource Center. So we would love to, just further that discussion.
If I could just add one thing. In addition to the lack of information, I think one of the things I found in my study was that the key terrible choice that undocumented parents face is this choice, at least the ones with the 4.5 million citizen children, is the choice between enrolling their children in services or programs that the children are eligible for. The children are eligible for generally the means-tested programs that the state and federal governments provide. But these parents are facing the choice that they perceive between enrolling their children in those programs that could help their development and then risking this contact with the government that could end up getting themselves deported and the families ripped apart. Right? So that's the terrible choice. And what ended up happening was that in our study, these children were enrolled in things like childcare subsidies that could help their learning, preschools at lower rates. And again, community-based organizations can make a difference. Some are providing things like, well, in that case, you can ask, well, why is childcare subsidy such a barrier? Why is that so threatening? Well, it's the proof of income and earnings that is often the barrier. And so sometimes the community-based organizations are providing things like the proof of income letters for, let's say, a day laborer who has inconsistent income and can't easily document it, and is really personally would not feel comfortable walking into an agency and providing that kind of documentation. Well, again, the community-based organizations can be the intermediaries in that sense and be the link to getting these kids the kinds of learning opportunities that they deserve and that are good in the long run for our economy.
And again, the policy solution there was one of the things we're the most proud of is the Executive Order 41 in New York City that we work with Mayor Bloomberg to issue, which is a policy that directly addresses this fear of deportation if you seek services. So the executive order basically says don't ask, don't tell. Don't ask immigration status information and don't tell. It's not your business. Your job is to provide services people are eligible for. So our next step, after we pass the DREAM Act, we're going to do the statewide executive order equivalent so that the state workers, also don't ask for the immigration status information. So you don't have to make this choice between, do I get the subsistence, safety net that my children need, or do I get deported? And so that's, we have a robust set of policy issues that we need to make happen.
If I'm not mistaken, Executive Order 41 kind of was one of the first in the kind of led the nation in that charge, right?
Yeah, and it's I think it's one of the strongest ones in the country. So I would love to see studies that show impact of when people are told directly that is the government policy, how much of a difference that makes, and just reinforce that argument so that we can take it up to the state level and other cities.
Yeah, no, we just finished a 3-state study for the Urban Institute on immigrants' access to health and human services, and Massachusetts was an example of another state that has gone far, and Texas was a state that had not gone very far on that front. So,
I'd like to open up to I know there's probably many burning questions in the audience and by webcast. So if you could signal yourself, there's people who will be floating around with microphones. We can begin to If not, I have plenty more questions, but I'm not sure if you want to listen to mine. Yes, Marcelo. If you could identify yourself.
Marcelo Suárez-Orozco, and
one of the authors of the
you very much
article,
for
so he
the,
should answer all the questions I've been asking.
He should ask
tough
and
questions.
answer.
I have a question. Self-contained, full service. So the question I have is as follows, and it has to do with the larger picture. As of September 15th, 2008, unauthorized immigration to the United States first came to a full stop and subsequently has gone negative. Perhaps for the first time in recent history, the U.S. is currently losing unauthorized immigrants, and there is no longer any net gain. How much, I guess, I'm asking a question we really didn't discuss when we were developing the paper. How much is this new context, this radically transformed picture in terms of unauthorized immigration to the United States, how much does that matter in the effort to generate a rational, humane, and workable policy mechanism to get the rapidly declining number of unauthorized fully out of the shadow and into the light of what a cultural democracy ought to provide?
Great question.
Well,
And the answer?
it may be a rapid decline, but it's certainly not going to go down to zero, and there are issues around even returns, especially for, I mean, one of the things we found, which really might not be surprising, is this anchor baby stereotype is absolutely not true. And so, first of all, most of our parents gave birth to their first child after at least, several years working in the United States. So they're developing roots here. They generally intend to stay. We have a doctoral student who's looking at this issue of orientation to homeland among our parents, and they're really quite rooted here. But I think, so it's not so much the loss, it's lower numbers coming in. But the numbers are high enough that I think these proportions are still extremely high of children of immigrants. And then if you look at the history of immigration outside the law or unauthorized immigration in the United States, it has been cyclical over at least quite a few decades. So if you look at May Nye's book that really documents this so well, as the economies of the United States and sending countries change, and the political climate changes, and the coalitions among advocates and policymakers and immigrant groups and political parties change, we see ups and downs in flows of unauthorized migration. This is an issue that is centrally a part of the United States ever since in 1888 with the Chinese Exclusion Act. The category of illegal immigrant was invented. Up till then, immigration to the United States was completely unfettered. And so there was no category of unauthorized or illegal immigrant. But since then, we've had cycles of economic and political change. And it seems I would not be predicting out more than a few years to predict which way the numbers are going to go, because there's traditionally been ups and downs in those flows.
I think it's also important to note, too, that many of the folks that are in the U.S. without documentation have overstayed their visas, or are in the process of looking for some type of authorized way to be here. So that some of the larger issue as well is comprehensive immigration reform and the 11 million undocumented, but also reforming our visa system so it actually works, and so that we can retain the best talent here.
That's right.
Other questions? Yes, in the third row.
Hi, I'm Alicia Galvez, professor at Lehman College, and I just received a text that 20 minutes ago one of our Lehman College Dream Team members was arrested outside of Cuomo's office in a civil disobedience. She's undocumented. She made the decision that this was the time, for the first time, for her to put her own status on the line and choose to become arrested. And, you know, I struggle personally, and I would be interested in hearing the responses of the panel with how we as scholars and advocates speak to our students for whom waiting is not an option. You know, I think it's valuable when we point out the longue durée and, you know, sort of look at things, you know, in terms of historical ebbs and flows and, you know, the inevitability that something's going to be resolved at some point. But I've found it increasingly more difficult, if not impossible, to look students in the eye who are you know, hitting the end points. You know, they've gotten the degrees that they can get. You know, they are, you know, at the end points, the dead ends of their educational trajectories and unable to go further. And so I'm curious, you know, from a psychological perspective, you know, from a developmental perspective, you know, what we can say, how we can, you know, I know activism helps, but what else can we say?
Definitely, very important, Carola.
Great question. You know, so on one level, civic engagement, helplessness and hopelessness is about the worst thing you can do to a person. You put them in a learned helpless state, it's very hard not to get depressed and to give up. And we know that, you know, there's some evidence from the qualitative work, and we need more quantitative studies to show this, but there's evidence that, you know, that these kids tend to be, you know, they have high levels of depression, anxiety, even suicidality is coming up, a lot of somatic issues. So, you know, you put people in learned helplessness state, and, you know, this is what will happen. So activism is the opposite of learned helplessness. It's very healthy psychologically. And so I like to encourage people to get as involved as possible, but exposing themselves, I actively discourage my students from exposing themselves because for precisely these reasons. So I'm asked point blank, you know, should I go and picket? And I say, if you were my daughter, I'd say no. I mean, that's my answer, because I don't think we can. So it's about getting their friends to do it and their siblings who are authorized to do it, and to get those of us who can come, you know, be out there. These kids themselves, it's a very dangerous, you know, path.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, you know, this is exactly why this is so difficult. But I think the answer comes from the young people themselves. The amazing slogan, undocumented, unafraid, and unapologetic, covers, you know, who you are, you know, what you feel about it, and implying what you're going to do about it. I mean, that is so powerful. We had an undocumented student who, so to speak, you know, came out with this identity, and her little brother, who's 11, said, you know, Lucia, if you're going to come out, I also want to come out. So he came out and said, I'm undocumented and I'm unafraid. And it's just like, little kids should not be put in that position. Yeah. You know, put in that position. But I feel like the self-affirmation, it's very similar to, you know, back in 2006, the big, you know, when millions of people marched in the street, the slogans weren't political slogans. It was about who you are ultimately. The big banner was, "We are America." And so to the extent that your activism is feeding into a profound sense of who you are, and to the extent that is aligned with your profound sense of where this nation has to be, I find that to be the most empowering kind of alignment of the personal, political, and the you know, the emotional and everything. And our job is to try to support that process as much as possible. So when we do civil disobediences, you know, it's the person we don't encourage or discourage, but we line up the legal support. You know, we're so lucky in New York to have the legal organizations with the experience, and you know, we have the relationships, you know, to the police department. You know, not everything goes smooth, you know, with these rallies, but we just have to think of a set of supports and program, you know, a combination of scholarships, legal support, mutual support, you know, and all of those things add up, and just help further the self-empowerment process, so that it becomes part of our community empowerment.
How do you? The other part of the question as well was, how do you talk to kids about this when they kind of feel like they've reached the end of their educational market?
I think what Carola and Chung-Wha said just made me think of last week we had a conference on community organizing in education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and the National Youth Immigration Alliance sent a few folks, and some of the principles were that at Actions they really consider the legal safety of their dreamer undocumented youth first and foremost. So it's really procedures and training in place around training of activists, training of youth activists, so that they are protecting each other. But I really think the key issue the key feature of this equation is not just the undocumented themselves, but so if there are 10 to 11 million undocumented in this country, there are many millions more who know somebody who's undocumented or who are interacting with the undocumented in their daily lives, and often, I think actually, given their work conditions, taking them for granted. So I think there's a tremendous amount that, again, organizations, local communities can do to build awareness. I wish there were some kind of national public awareness campaign. The politics make that difficult, but these have to be local. These have to be kind of local grassroots efforts to get the people who might not necessarily be engaged in this issue to be much more engaged, so that when these actions occur, the message is that you are being supported, and we care about your future and protecting your safety in actions, for example. So.
Yeah. More questions from the audience. Chris.
I'm Chris Sabatini. Given the complexity of the undocumented status within families, curious what this would mean for any potential comprehensive immigration reform. Because one of the things that was discussed during the Bush administration was sending undocumented immigrants back to have them apply. That would seem to have terrible wrenching effects on families. And that debate didn't seem to come up when this was being discussed in 2006, 2007. So I'm curious how, if there's any sort of compromise, it would seem that it could cause more damage on undocumented immigrant families than it would do well. So I'm just curious how you would address that and why that hasn't come up. And the last issue is, what do you think of the role of business? How can business groups, employers, and the like speak out more to do this? This is certainly a logical issue, certainly pulls at the heartstrings. But in terms of the raw economic numbers, how can this case be made better to begin to push politicians to step up to the plate and maybe recognize that campaign donations and the like are on the table when it comes to this?
Great. Carola, do you want to?
The first, I was focusing on the second.
The first one on how comprehensive compromise and combination immigration reform.
In terms of separate, I would say that we have to actively advocate against the idea of in mixed status families sending people back to wait in line, because that simply creates family separations, and oftentimes they're protracted. Often they span nearly the whole childhood of the kids. And it's a no-brainer to know that you don't have to be a developmental psychologist to know that separating kids from their parents is not healthy for them. So I think that we really have to be very active about making the point of the developmental implications for the kids, and not wrenching them away if they stand in line. And so there has to be, processes.
Here, do you want to address that as well? I'm going to ask Chung-Wha to address the question about the business speaking up. But here, do you want to add to that?
Well, I was going to talk about the business thing.
But you are? Okay, go for it.
Okay. Well, I think there's a lot that businesses can do. First, to realize that access, especially to higher education, in many of these states where undocumented youth can't access it, often what happens is it's privately funded in some way, and so the private sector has an enormous role to play there. The business sector also understands the value of investing in children's learning, and increasingly from birth, and that education really is the key to the future workforce of the United States and to keep it competitive. And if you look at our international comparisons, we're not doing well. And so every sector in our society really needs to do a lot more work. And to write off 1/3 of the children of immigrants in this country to lives of lowered educational opportunity, as Carola said, it just doesn't make any kind of economic sense. So taking the moral issue out of the equation, just thinking about the investments, I think the business community has a powerful role to play. And in some states, there have been these unlikely coalitions. Utah is an example of a state that has passed a mix, I have to say kind of an odd mix of laws recently around unauthorized immigration, but the business community there is one that has, understands that this is actually a workforce that's important for the future of that state, and you can interpret that in a lot of different ways, but I think there's a lot the business community can do.
And when you talk about fertility rates, it's the immigrants are the ones that are keeping the U.S. population younger in regard to many of our global competitors.
Immigrants are themselves more younger, and so regardless of really how many children each family is having, younger people are more likely to have kids. So so that's like a large part of the piece is that immigrants are younger than the rest of the population. But you're right, they're the future of our society.
That's why it looks so young. I mean, I think we have a really, we have a shared interest, the immigrant community and business and even labor and faith communities. I mean, I think the problem, a lot of the civic-minded business leaders are very supportive of comprehensive immigration reform. I think the challenge is that I think it does take courage to kind of step out instead of just believing in that in the economic sphere, stepping out and actually influencing politics so that the scale tips toward making that happen, because every business community has other policy priorities. But I think if everyone, all the stakeholders kind of make it a little more of a priority, I think we'll go closer to getting some political response at the level that we need.
And just to put a small plug in, we did a study last year that looked at the effects of restrictive versus non-restrictive ordinances in 53 cities across the U.S. and found that cities with restrictive ordinances had more or less 18% decline in overall jobs in that city compared to non-restrictive cities. So that's another reason for business to speak out. I want to take one last round of questions. I know we're running a few minutes late, but we did start a few minutes late, but the reception is waiting for everyone in the next room. I'll take a few questions together. There's one here on the fourth row, then there's one in the, I think it was the third, toward the back. Why don't you go first?
Hi, my name is Marissa Centino, and I had a question in regards to, sometimes I feel like there is a perception of what a mixed status family looks like. Low income, both the parents are English learners or maybe don't speak English, but oftentimes they look a lot more like you and me than people think. And I'm wondering, in essence, those people also become undocumented, and they have to live in the shadows as well. So what would you say to those families that believe very strongly in the American system, but at the same time are directly affected? And then also what they can do to put themselves forward to push their own personal needs in terms of immigration without putting their own families at risk.
Great. And we'll take a second question together so we can answer them at the same time. There's a fourth,
Luis Argueta, I'm a filmmaker. I'd like to have you address your comments in light of the present election year politics and with the sad reality that the Obama administration has deported and separated more families than the Bush administration. And I think we're in a very interesting situation here.
Great question. Let me address both of those.
I just would like to answer Marissa's question. I think the message has to be, you're absolutely right. People living in mixed family status are everywhere. I think there used to be a saying in the gay community, we are everywhere. And I think that that's increasingly true. And you know, I think we have to think about, the message should be keep up hope. I think this is the new civil rights issue of the moment. This is the equivalent to what happened in the 60s with the African American community. It's equivalent to what happened in the 80s with the gay community. I mean, this is the issue of the moment. And you know, it takes, unfortunately, way too long. But you know, if we collectively put our efforts together, sooner or later the barriers have to come down.
I mean, I think there's also huge opportunities to work together with the African American community, because it's, you know, and I think it's up to us to make those connections. Because I think it's been hard. Sometimes there's tensions. Well, you know, this is a new civil rights movement, and you're the old. You know, I think we just have different kinds of barriers. You know, immigration status is a specific immigrant community barrier that we have. Other people of color or women or other communities have different kinds of systemic barriers. So I want to make sure that we talk about our work and the urgency of our work together with the urgency of other. You know, other things are happening. You know, with some of the police shootings, and I mean, this country is at a crisis. We need to really address these civil rights issues. You know, just in such a better way. Leading up to Luis's question, but unfortunately, especially around election times, none of these policy proposals or kind of visions or, you know, common sense, you know, solutions find their way to the political space. You know, we get kind of dominated by pretty much very simplistic, stupid, polarized, you know, toxic, you know, kind of, you know, I don't even call it a debate, really, you know, and so I don't know that we can change that environment overnight. I think what we can do, and some of what we are doing, is in addition to kind of on-the-ground programming, we're trying to mobilize the immigrant vote to hold elected officials accountable. Because I think during election time, you just have to use your vote to make the case. If the Latino immigrant votes and the voting bloc, if we just organize ourselves into a unified, powerful voting bloc with a clear set of policy agenda, just like we did up in Albany. We didn't just gather and ask for random things. We had, here's our top 10, you know, Albany agenda items. So we want you to, you know, just go down the list and support it. In Washington, D.C., I think we need to first show our power as not only growing in number, but growing in power and political power. And then after that, directly link it to the kind of changes. We have not been shy about, no matter what your party affiliation is, about the facts, because you can't hide the facts that we've had over 1 million immigrants deported since President Obama came into office. That is not something we can gloss over. We need to keep the pressure up, but also be aware of the right-wing forces that are imposing the kind of pressures that, you know, even put more sympathetic politicians in a position where they just can't just take that courageous step. So I think I look at this election as a huge opportunity. So we invite all immigrant groups to join us, not as a kind of a separate effort, but a pan-immigrant, you know, voting bloc with a strong political message and demands.
Hiro, would you like to address as well?
Well, I was going to say, one of the messages I took away from Luis Argueta was the one who asked that question, and it's a very powerful film called Abused about the Postville raid, was that the documentation of the worst exploitation and you know, really the numbers, I'm not sure how many Americans really know how many millions have been deported under the Obama administration, but in fact the Postville raid was an example of when and if people hadn't seen those images, they wouldn't have reacted that way. But when these workers were taken out of the factory in chains, that was a very powerful image. And the government stepped back a little bit, at least from those very large workplace raids. Of course, they didn't actually slow down the deportations very much, and they became more invisible. But I think the documentation of the conditions, the very high rates of illegally low wages among these workers, for example, that needs to continue under any administration.
And I think that we're ending on an important note insofar as the election year. Is that what we're talking about insofar as, going back to your article, the premise for this discussion, the children growing up in mixed-status households and their educational attainment, immigration reform. I mean, educational attainment is actually, for the Latino voting bloc overall, that's actually, polls show that's actually, education is actually a higher priority than immigration reform is these days. And something like bettering the conditions for education, showing the importance of immigration, the economy or whatnot. These are all things that, as Latinos hopefully get out there, or immigrants overall get out there and vote and show their numbers in the 2012 election, that'll hopefully start to show some policy for us. I mean, in the last presidential election, there were certain states that actually the president won because of the Latino vote, and I would assume because of the immigrant vote as well. So I think that's kind of, as we move forward, whether it's the passage of the New York State Dream Act or other issues, that really kind of getting out there and showing your power at the voting at the ballot box is one of the, I think, chief ways to be able to influence policy and hopefully reverse some of these detrimental developmental outcomes that we're seeing as a result of growing up in mixed-status households. On that, I would like to, again, thank the New York Immigration Coalition for partnering with us in this. And in addition to Chung-Wha, Melanie Reyes, who's back there, I'd also like to thank Rich Andre on the policy team. I'm not sure if he's in the room right now, and the rest of the policy team who have put this event together. And I'd like to again thank our esteemed panel and Carola and Hiro for joining us. It's been, I think, a very enlightening discussion, and we can continue that discussion in the next room during the reception. Unfortunately, if you're joining us by webcast, you can't partake in the reception, but the rest of us can. So thank you again, everybody, for coming.